May 13th, 1977, just past 10 o'clock at night, Woodside, Queens. A quiet residential block on 46th Street. The kind of neighborhood where Irish families raised their kids and nobody asked too many questions. Michael J. Spillane, 43 years old, the man they called the last gentleman gangster of Hell's Kitchen, stepped out of a parked car and walked toward the entrance of his apartment building. He was carrying a small bag of groceries. He'd been hiding in this building for months in his in-laws' apartment, trying to disappear from a war he was already losing. He didn't see the shooter. He never had a chance. 5 bullets cut him down on the sidewalk outside the lobby, 2 in the chest, 3 more as he fell. The groceries scattered across the pavement. A carton of milk burst open and ran into the gutter. Mickey Spillane was dead before the neighbors finished dialing the police. He bled out in under 3 minutes. And the shooter, a stocky butcher from Brooklyn named Roy DeMeo, was already gone, halfway across the 59th Street Bridge, back to the meat market and the bar on Flatlands Avenue where he kept his crew. This wasn't just another mob hit. Spillane wasn't some street-level hood. He was the king of Hell's Kitchen. For more than a decade, he ran the west side of Manhattan with old-school Irish manners. He wore suits. He paid for funerals. He kissed babies in the neighborhood. He shook down longshoremen and bookmakers and union locals, but he did it with a smile and a handshake. And when Roy DeMeo, a made man with the Gambino family, put 5 rounds into him on that Queens sidewalk, it wasn't just murder, it was a transfer of power. A century of Irish control of the West Side ended on that block. This is the story of how a single bullet, fired as a favor between 2 crime families, handed Hell's Kitchen to the Italians and gave birth to the most savage Irish gang New York had ever seen. The crew that came after Mickey Spillane wouldn't kiss babies. They'd cut up bodies in bathtubs. They'd call themselves the Westies. And they only existed because Roy DeMeo pulled a trigger in Woodside. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The kid who ordered Spillane killed wasn't even 30 years old. He was a sociopath named Jimmy Coonan, and he'd been planning this murder for 15 years, since he was a teenager, since the day Mickey Spillane kidnapped his father and beat him bloody in front of him. This wasn't business. This was revenge, dressed up as a corporate merger. You have to understand who Mickey Spillane was. Born in 1933, raised on 10th Avenue in Hell's Kitchen, when it was the most violent slum on the west side of Manhattan. His parents were Irish immigrants. His father worked the docks. As a kid, Mickey was an altar boy at Sacred Heart of Jesus on West 51st Street. By his early 20s, he'd taken over the bookmaking and loan sharking operations that ran out of every Irish bar from 34th Street to 59th. By 1966, he was the West Side. He controlled the bookmakers. He controlled the union locals at the Javits Center site. He controlled the kickbacks from the longshoremen. He even controlled, through political connections, who got hired at the Madison Square Garden construction projects. They estimated his bookmaking alone pulled in close to $20,000 a week. That's over $1 million a year in 1966 money. And he did it with style. Spillane didn't believe in unnecessary violence. He believed in respect. He'd walk into the White House bar on 45th and 10th, buy a round for the whole place, and listen to people's problems. Somebody's son got pinched. Somebody's mother needed rent money. Mickey took care of it. That's why they called him the last gentleman gangster. He thought he was Tammany Hall reincarnated. He thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. Here's where it gets interesting. In 1966, when Mickey was at the peak of his power, he made one mistake that would define the rest of his life. He kidnapped a small-time numbers operator named John Coonan, beat him, held him for a ransom of $12,000, released him only after the money came in. The Coonan family paid. They were small-time. They had no muscle to push back. But John Coonan had a son. The kid was 15 years old at the time, skinny, blonde, blue-eyed, looked like a choir boy. And that kid, James Michael Coonan, sat in his bedroom that night and made a promise. He told his older brother Jackie that he was going to kill Mickey Spillane. He was going to take everything Spillane had and he was going to do it before he turned 30. Jimmy Coonan turned 30 in 1976. He started the war that year. By the mid-70s, the world had changed. The Irish were leaving Hell's Kitchen. Italian, Puerto Rican, and black families were moving in. The neighborhood was being eyed by developers for the massive Westway project and the convention center that would eventually become Javits. Whoever controlled the labor unions on the West Side was about to control hundreds of millions of dollars in construction kickbacks. Mickey Spillane saw it coming. So did Jimmy Coonan. And so did a man in Staten Island named Paul Castellano, the new boss of the Gambino crime family. Castellano was a builder, literally. He owned construction companies. He had concrete interests. He saw the West Side waterfront and the convention center site, and he saw billions of dollars. The Gambinos already controlled the concrete pouring in Manhattan through what would later be called the Concrete Club. What they didn't have was the West Side labor locals. Mickey Spillane had those. Mickey Spillane wasn't selling. Coonan understood this perfectly. He went to the Gambinos with a proposition. Through a Gambino soldier named Danny Grillo, Coonan got a meeting with the captain who would change his life, Roy DeMeo. 43 years old, a short, thick-set man with dead eyes, born in Brooklyn in 1942. A former butcher's apprentice who ran the most prolific murder crew in the history of the American Mafia out of a bar called the Gemini Lounge in Flatlands. Some federal estimates put DeMeo's body count at over 100 murders. Most of those bodies were never found, because DeMeo's specialty wasn't just killing, it was disappearing people. The Gemini method: shoot the victim in the head with a silenced .22, wrap a towel around the wound to stop the bleeding, stab them through the heart to drain the body, drag them to the bathtub, dismember them, package the parts, ship them to the Fountain Avenue dump in Brooklyn, or feed them to the chum grinders on a fishing boat. No body, no case. Coonan and DeMeo recognized each other immediately. They were the same animal in different uniforms. Here's how the deal worked. DeMeo took Coonan to meet Castellano at the Veterans and Friends Social Club in Bensonhurst. The proposal was simple. Coonan would take over the West Side. He'd kick a percentage upstairs to the Gambinos. In exchange, the Gambinos would back him with muscle, contracts, and protection. Coonan would deliver the union locals. He'd be allowed to operate as an autonomous Irish crew under Gambino sponsorship. He'd handle the dirty work nobody else wanted, including, when needed, the dismemberment work, which Coonan had a sick talent for. Castellano had one condition: Mickey Spillane had to go. Castellano had tried to negotiate with Spillane through intermediaries for 2 years. Spillane wouldn't budge. He thought he could outlast the Italians. He thought the West Side belonged to the Irish forever. Castellano was done talking. Coonan said yes, but he had a problem. He couldn't kill Spillane himself. Spillane knew every Irish face on the West Side. Spillane had eyes everywhere. Any Westie Coonan sent would be recognized in a heartbeat. They needed an outsider, a face Spillane had never seen. A killer with no connection to Hell's Kitchen. DeMeo volunteered as a favor, as a down payment on the new alliance. By the spring of 1977, Mickey Spillane knew he was losing. 3 of his closest lieutenants had been murdered in the previous 12 months. Tom Devaney, his enforcer, shot dead in a midtown bar in January of '77. Tom Kapatos, his bookmaker, gunned down on 10th Avenue. Eddie Comiskey, a stone-cold killer who'd done time with Coonan and switched sides, butchered and dismembered by Coonan himself in a back room. The bodies were dropping. The Westies, as the FBI would later name them, were everywhere. And the union locals were already starting to shift. Money that used to flow to Spillane was now flowing to Coonan, and through him to the Gambinos. Mickey did what he'd never done before. He ran. He took his wife Maureen and his kids, and he moved out of Hell's Kitchen. He moved to his in-laws' apartment in Woodside, Queens. A second-floor walk-up on a quiet residential block. He thought Queens would be safer. The Irish mob didn't operate in Queens. Italians did. He figured Coonan's crew wouldn't follow him out there. He figured if he stayed off the West Side for a year, Coonan would burn himself out. Spillane was a smart man, but he made one fatal miscalculation. He still thought this was an Irish problem. He didn't know Coonan had married the Italians. You know what the FBI didn't see coming? They didn't see the Gambino angle until years later. They thought Spillane's enemies were all West Side Irish. They had no idea that a Gambino captain from Brooklyn had been hand-delivered Spillane's Queen's address by a kid from Hell's Kitchen. Coonan got the address from a relative of Spillane's wife. He gave it to DeMeo. DeMeo did his homework. He spent 4 nights in late April watching the building. He learned Spillane's schedule. He learned what time he came home. He learned that Spillane was carrying a gun but had grown careless. The man had a routine. Wednesday, Friday, Saturday nights, Spillane would drive into the city, meet with what was left of his crew at safe locations, then come home between 10 and 10:30 p.m. He'd park on the street. He'd walk to the front door. He'd be exposed for 15, maybe 20 seconds on that sidewalk. 20 seconds was all DeMeo needed. May 13th, 1977, a Friday. The night was warm. The streetlights on the block were dim. DeMeo drove out to Woodside in a stolen Buick. He parked half a block down from Spillane's building. He waited 2 hours. He was wearing a dark windbreaker, gloves, and a knit cap pulled low. He had a .38 revolver in his right hand and a backup piece in his waistband. At 10:15 p.m., Spillane's car pulled up. Spillane got out alone. He had a small grocery bag. He locked the car. He started walking. DeMeo got out of the Buick. He crossed the street at an angle. Spillane never turned around. The first shot hit him in the upper back. Spillane stumbled forward, hit the brick wall of the building, started to turn. The second shot hit him in the chest. He went down on his knees. DeMeo walked up and put 3 more rounds into him at close range. The whole hit took 14 seconds. DeMeo walked back to the Buick. He drove away. A neighbor across the street heard the shots and looked out the window. She saw a stocky man walking calmly to a car. She told police she thought he might have been carrying a paper bag. She didn't see his face. Nobody saw his face. Within an hour, DeMeo was at the Gemini Lounge in Brooklyn, drinking a glass of red wine with his crew. He told them nothing. The NYPD recovered 5 .38 caliber shell casings on the sidewalk. Time of death, 10:22 p.m. Cause of death, exsanguination from multiple gunshot wounds. The medical examiner noted that 2 of the rounds had passed through the heart. Spillane had died on his feet before the last shots were fired. When the news hit the West Side the next morning, the Irish neighborhood went silent. Spillane's wife, Maureen, a member of one of the most respected Irish families in Hell's Kitchen, collapsed. The funeral was held at Sacred Heart of Jesus, the same church where Mickey had served as an altar boy 30 years earlier. Hundreds came, politicians, union men, old-time bookmakers. They cried. They drank. They knew what it meant. The last gentleman gangster was dead. And nobody, not the NYPD, not the FBI, not the West Side itself, ever brought a single charge for the murder. To this day, no one was ever indicted for killing Mickey Spillane. The case remains officially unsolved, but every wise guy in New York knew within a week who pulled the trigger. Roy DeMeo had bragged about it to his crew. Jimmy Coonan had paid him in cash. Paul Castellano had blessed it. Here's the crazy part. Within 90 days of Spillane's murder, the entire economic structure of Hell's Kitchen flipped. Coonan and his number 2, a stone killer named Mickey Featherstone, walked into every social club, every union local, every bookmaking operation on the West Side and announced new management. The kickbacks from the Javits Center construction site, which would eventually total over $400 million in labor contracts, started flowing through Coonan to the Gambinos. The bookmaking, the loan sharking, the extortion of restaurants and bars, from 34th to 59th, all of it was now under Coonan. He kicked 10% upstairs to Castellano. He kept the rest. Within a year, Coonan was clearing $250,000 a month. And then the killing started. Because Coonan wasn't Spillane. Coonan didn't believe in respect or restraint. Coonan believed that fear was the only currency that mattered. Between 1977 and 1986, the Westies, the gang the FBI would name after Coonan's crew took over, would murder at least 30 people in Manhattan, most of them dismembered, most of them never found. They turned a Hell's Kitchen apartment on 43rd Street into a butcher's shop. They called it doing pieces of work. Coonan would later tell an informant that, quote, "You can't be arrested for a murder if they can't find the body," end quote. He'd learned that from Roy DeMeo. The irony is that everyone involved in the Spillane hit died violently or rotted in prison. Roy DeMeo got his reward. He never had to answer for Spillane, but his own murder crew became too greedy, too sloppy, and too dangerous to keep alive. By 1983, Paul Castellano had decided DeMeo was a liability. On January 10, 1983, DeMeo's body was found in the trunk of his own Cadillac in the parking lot of the Varna Boat Club in Brooklyn. He'd been shot multiple times in the head. He was 40 years old. He'd been killed by his own crew on orders from above, the same method he'd used on 100 other men. Some investigators believe his closest friend, Anthony Center, pulled the trigger. The body was found exactly as DeMeo would have wanted his victims found, by accident. Paul Castellano outlived DeMeo by exactly 2 years and 11 months. On December 16, 1985, John Gotti's crew gunned him down outside Sparks Steakhouse at 210 East 46th Street in Manhattan. 6 shots, point blank. Castellano was 70 years old. He died on the sidewalk, just like Mickey Spillane, in a city he thought he owned. Jimmy Coonan held on longer. He ran the West Side for almost a decade after Spillane. But by 1986, his own number 2, Mickey Featherstone, had flipped. Featherstone had been framed by Coonan for a murder he didn't commit. He cooperated with the federal government. In 1988, Coonan and the core of the Westies were convicted under the RICO statute. Coonan got 75 years in federal prison. He died behind bars in 2017. He never made it out. And Mickey Spillane, he was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Queens. His wife Maureen raised the kids alone on the West Side. The Irish neighborhood she remembered disappeared inside of 15 years. The Javits Center went up. Luxury condos replaced tenements. The White House bar closed. Sacred Heart of Jesus is still there, still standing on West 51st Street, but the parishioners who used to fill it on Sunday mornings are gone. Hell's Kitchen is now one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Manhattan. The hit on Mickey Spillane was the moment the Irish mob in New York stopped being independent. It became a subsidiary of the Italians. The Westies, with all their savagery and all their corpses in trash bags, were never really their own organization. They were Gambino contractors. Every dollar they made, every body they buried, every union they shook down, a piece went to Brooklyn. And when the Gambinos decided they were finished, they were finished. That's the real story of May 13th, 1977. A butcher from Brooklyn drove to a quiet street in Queens and killed a man eating dinner with his in-laws. The shot took 14 seconds. The consequences lasted 40 years. Mickey Spillane thought he was the king of the West Side. He thought respect would protect him. He thought he was a gentleman. But here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. There are no gentlemen in this life. There are only killers, and the men who haven't been killed yet. Mickey Spillane learned that on a Woodside sidewalk, with a carton of milk pouring into the gutter beside him. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. Drop a comment below. What Mafia hit should we cover next?